All right, well, today I wanted to talk about my experience with the halo and the Failo effect in the corporate world. As you know, I talked about my experiences with the Failo effect working at a gas station when I was very overweight and balding during my college years. But today I really wanted to talk about my experience with the Failo and the halo effect, specifically in the corporate world. Back in 2016, I was fresh out of college starting a new job taking inbound phone calls. It was one of those very monotonous jobs where you basically spoke to clients all day on the phone. I was not even a full-time employee at this company yet, and any day that you took off would be unpaid. You didn't have any 401k, there was no dental. You had okay health insurance, but pretty much, you were just a contractor. For context, when I started this job, I was very new to the corporate world and had no real idea how to dress well in the corporate world. I had one hair transplant by this point. Prior to the hair transplant, I was about a Norwood 4 with a really bad receding hairline, and I was also starting to thin in the crown. After I had my first hair transplant back in 2014, my hairline was restored, but there wasn't a lot of density in it, so I wasn't really able to style my hair other than combing it forward and really growing it out longer. This resulted in somewhat of a juvenile type haircut as, I had to make the hair kind of rust down my forehead. And when you're a Norwood 4, and you get a hair transplant, my first hair transplant doctor constructed me a pretty decent hairline. But the problem is, I got 2,000 grafts of FUE in the frontal zone, and they can only put so many hairs in each square centimeter. So, he did give me a good amount of hair, but it really wasn't enough for me to really style my hair in a way that looked good. So I kind of was forced into this haircut. It really resulted in somewhat of a juvenile type haircut where it really rested down my forehead, kind of like a surfer look without the density behind it. Back then, also, my dress sense for the corporate world, it wasn't horrendous, but it definitely wasn't great either. I definitely wore a lot of polos, khaki pants, not that great dress shoes. And also, back then, I started growing facial hair. I was able to grow facial hair by this time, but I didn't really trim it down regularly. I never really grew it out the facial hair super long. But I definitely didn't trim it, down to a guard that would look very professional. What I did have going for me was that I was 6'2", in relatively good shape. When I went for my first promotion, the interview didn't go well. The whole time they were kind of drilling me with questions that I really just had trouble answering. Back then I was relatively young and I just wasn't used to the kind of interview questions they were kind of hurling at me. They wanted the questions to be answered in a very specific way, and I definitely really stumbled through the interview. I heard back a few days later that I didn't get the promotion, and I was definitely very down about this because I had really worked hard the previous 6 months, and my metrics were actually pretty good for the most part. It was interesting because the feedback that I had heard was that I repeated myself many times during the interview, and that they just didn't think that I was ready for this new role, and that, would if they weren't ready, I wasn't ready to be a full-time employee at this company. They wanted me to get more experience in my current role and kind of really excel in the role, and then, maybe down the line they would consider me. I really think it came down to my hairstyle, because my metrics were pretty good. And my hairstyle at the time, I really think it gave me the Failo effect. Not as much as it would if I was if I was, still balding, back when I was in college. But because I really had to grow it out longer and I had to kind of comb it down my forehead, I really think that really played a part in them thinking that I was very juvenile, I was very immature. So a few months later, I actually decided to go for my second hair transplant. As I mentioned, my frontal zone was still very thin on the corners, and I really wanted to fill it in. After the hair transplant, I was actually able to keep my hair long at the time, and I started seeing progress about 4 to 5 months later. The new hairs were starting to grow in. For my second hair transplant, I had 2,000 FUE grafts, and this really helped in giving me much more density in the hairline. I definitely don't have 100% density, but I would say between the two hair transplants, they were really able to build out my frontal hairline and give me a good amount of density behind it to really make it appear that I have a full head of hair. And I really think this was a big turning point in my career in the corporate world, mainly because I was able to now style my hair in many more ways. I was able to, do like the front part. I was able to part my hair, and I was really able to gel my hair up in the front, anywhere from like an inch to around 2.5 inches. That's usually where I kind of usually kept my hair between 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches on the top most times. And this really helped me because it really gave me like the corporate professional kind of look. I was lucky that in my mid zone and in my crown, I still had a pretty much close to a full head of hair in those regions. On top of the second hair transplant, I also started watching like YouTube videos and how to dress more professionally for the corporate world. So I started wearing like more fitted dress shirts, the standard, white dress shirt, light blue dress shirt. I went to the tailors and, got them tailored to my body. And I was able to also wear, like tailored dress pants, like black dress shoes. Made sure like my color of my belt matched my shoes. I really wasn't doing that stuff prior. I was just kind of throwing on a polo, a pair of khakis, and like the dress shoes I wore might have been like light brown or something like that. I didn't put much thought into like the color scheme and matching my dress clothes. This is what made me realize that like the halo effect really does come into play. Like you're the same, you work the same, like you're a hard worker, but honestly, it really comes down to, in the corporate world, your professional image. How tall are you? Are you in good shape? Are you wearing, tight fitted professional clothes? Do you have a hairstyle that is, seen as very professional? Those are the things in the corporate world that I think really get you hired. Especially in a job interview when they're sitting across from you and they're looking at your face, they're looking at your hair, they're looking at how tall you are. Those types of things really, really matter. And I don't think many hiring managers will really admit that, but there's a lot of studies, especially on, taller men making more money in the corporate world than shorter men. And I kind of see it play out. I've seen it get played out in the corporate world in my experience. So many months later, actually about 8 months later, I was about a year and a half into being a contractor. Another opportunity to become a full-time worker at this company came up. And this time I actually interviewed with different hiring managers. And I was able to answer the questions like much more concisely, and I even felt more confident during the interview. One being that I've been through that interview process before, but the other way is, I was dressed much more professionally, and I had a lot more hair at that point because eight months in, the results started really showing. Especially as I grew it out, the hair became thicker and thicker in the front, and it's really crazy what more hair and better clothes can do for you in the corporate world. You're the exact same person, but it's like, your coworkers, hiring managers, your managers, they just treat you much better. there's a lot of really hard workers in the corporate world that maybe aren't dressed very well. They're not very good looking, and they get passed up for promotions all the time. Whereas somebody who doesn't have the skills and doesn't have the work ethic, because they have a professional image, during that interview they're just perceived as being a better worker, as being a better employee, and they're given those positive traits based on their looks. And it's really unfair, but that's really how the corporate world is a lot of the times. So a few days later, I found out that I got the promotion and I was able to start working for this company full time. So fast forward many years, and I was going for another promotion that was, let's just say, it was many pay grades above what I was currently doing. By this point, from a looks perspective, my hair was continuing to improve in density as I was on a finasteride, Rogaine, and I was taking biotin and saw palmetto. I was on that regimen, and I had been on finasteride for about 7 years at that point. I was working in a metrics driven environment, and I was performing well in my role. I definitely can't say I was like the top performer, but I was definitely probably in the top 10-15% of performers when it came to metrics. By this time, I'd also really started to lean down a lot. In the years prior, I was in decent shape, but I was probably in the 15, probably closer to about 20% body fat range. You could kind of see it in my face. I had, in years prior, I had a good amount of baby fat around my jaw, around, on my neck, my cheekbones. My face wasn't very prominent. By this time, I really, really focused on trying to get in really good shape. Through a combination of, just lifting, strength training, and just a lot of cardio, I was able to really get down to probably around 10 to 12% body fat, where I, had visible abs. My facial features were really starting to show. My jawline was becoming, more defined. Nothing crazy, but definitely much more noticeable if I compare pictures of me, in years prior as to, what I did when I was going for this promotion. I just looked visibly better, noticeably better in pictures. I had a female manager at the time that suggested that I go for a promotion to a role that was a few pay grades higher than what I was doing currently. So, after giving it some thought, I decided to go for it. I figured, hey, if I don't get this new role, if I don't get this big promotion, I still have this role, and it'll give me, more interview experience. For context, my manager was fairly attractive, and she seemed to think very highly of me. As an example, she'd always compliment me on my work, and especially when metrics came out each week. She was very enthusiastic when she saw me. She always kind of, said, "Great job, you're doing so well." Like, she would always ask me, like, "What are you doing anything fun this weekend?" She was just very friendly to me, and part of it, I think, was I am a very hard worker. Like, I did really try to meet the metrics and really try to do the best job I could. But I think, overall, it was the looks maxing that I did in previous years that really, I think, got her to really believe in my abilities. And that's just the cold-hearted truth is, if I still had, the hairstyle where I had to comb it over my forehead, and if I wasn't as in good of shape, I don't think she would have really believed in my abilities and really vouched for me for this new role. So for this new role, the hiring manager was a woman as well. She was kind of like in her late 30s, early 40s. I was able to do some research prior to interviewing, as my manager advised me to reach out to her to express some interest in the role. And when I was researching this hiring manager, funny enough, I could see that she was married to a guy who had very like similar features to me. That he actually looked a lot like me. He was about my same height. We have the same hair color and like very like similar type facial features. I can say this probably played a lot into her hiring me, I think. I would put like a lot. I'd put money on this, to be honest. But the first thing I noticed is that, while I was interviewing for this role, like while she was asking me questions, it was almost like she was giving me softball questions, like hoping that I would give her good answers. And when I was answering the questions and providing examples of what I was being asked about, I could see her smiling and nodding. This was like over a virtual interview because this was like during COVID. But she was giving me a lot of positive feedback, like while I was answering the questions. And if I compare this to, the interviews that I had in years prior, especially the interview in my first interview when I went for the first promotion, the interviewers didn't give me any positive feedback while I answered the questions. They had a very like neutral look on their face, and they only really gave me any sort of nod or recognition when I was done making a point. But I noticed that since I really worked on looks maxing, when you look better, whether you're a good looking person or you look good in some way, when you're answering interview questions, you will notice that there's a lot more positive feedback. It might be smiling, it might be nodding in agreement of what you're saying. But if you're just an average looking person, or you have like the Failo effect going for whatever reason, you're not going to get any sort of positive feedback while you're answering interview questions. They're really just going to stare at you blankly. If you're more of a sub 5 male, they may even give you kind of like a confused, disgusted look. And this is all like subconscious. This isn't, a lot of the interviewers aren't doing this consciously. It's just they're reacting to what is in front of them. They're reacting to your face. They're reacting to your hair, your skin tone, your height in some ways. When you walk into the room and you shake their hand, that stuff. I hate to say it, but for most jobs, especially jobs where you're talking to people or you have exposure to the public, a lot of companies, a lot of hiring managers, they'll hire a good-looking person over an average or unattractive person the vast majority of the time. That's the cold hard truth. That's what I've seen and experienced. And it's never really going to change, or there's not much you can do about it except for looks max. So about a week later, my manager gave me a call on my break and let me know that I got the promotion. One of the things I remember her saying is that she really believed in me and she just knew that I would get the job. It turns out that her and the hiring manager were actually really good friends. I didn't really know this at the time, but in my next role, the hiring manager was my next boss, was my next manager. And one of the things she had told me is that, my former manager really talked me up, and it really made a huge difference in her decision to hire me. To kind of tie this all back to when I knew the halo effect was real, was I had gone to a happy hour with my former manager and a couple other people that we used to work with. And we were having a few beers, having a few drinks. And I had joked to my former manager. I made kind of like a stupid joke about my one side of the face is better than the other. And I remember she reacted and she started laughing, and she like pushed my shoulder and she was like, no, get out of here. You're a handsome guy. Right when she said that, I realized that I would have never gotten this promotion if I had done all the looks maxing I had done. If I hadn't, really leaned down and gotten to a low body fat, if I hadn't gotten 2 hair transplants and lost a ton of weight, um, I'd probably still be in that same role. I guess it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but um, that was the moment where I really realized that the halo effect really, really helped me in that situation. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like, comment down below, and subscribe. Until next time, take care.